diretora da Global Change Institute do Chipre. Ela foi Visiting Fellow no programa Science, Technology and Society da John Kennedy School of Government em Harvard. Esse ano ela foi ganhadora do prêmio Eminent Scholar da International Studies Association. Ela vem trabalhando com estudos pós-coloniais, feministas, com tempo, questões de tempo e temporalidade. E também eu gostaria de agradecer muito aqui o Gonçalo Berron, que é da FES, né, a Fundação Frederic Ebert, que é parceira da ABRE, né, desde a gestão passada da ABRE, com a professora Deise Ventura, a gente estabeleceu essa parceria e foi isso que viabilizou a vinda, né, tanto da Ana Agathangelou quanto da Fanny Cury, que deu a palestra para vocês hoje também na parte da manhã, né? A ABRE vem tentando, né, vamos dizer assim, adensar esses laços, esses vínculos, né, com os movimentos sociais, com as organizações não governamentais, né? Então, eu agradeço muito a FES, e especialmente aqui o nosso interlocutor na FES, que é o Gonçalo. E eu vou passar agora a palavra para ele. Claro, né, agradeço todo mundo que está aqui presente para essa palestra de abertura. Eu acho que eu vou falar sexta vez, tem fone lá fora, para quem quiser.
Oi, boa noite a todas, todos, todas. É um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês. A Fundação Friedrich Ebert é uma fundação de origem alemã. Na Alemanha tem um arranjo particular, que é que todos os partidos que têm presença no parlamento têm direito a uma parte do dinheiro público que vai para a cooperação internacional. Então, a fundação faz parte também desse arranjo já desde a pós-guerra. E aqui no Brasil temos uma atuação de mais de 40 anos, né? O partido da minha fundação é o Partido Social Democrata alemão, né? E tem dos outros partidos por ali. Nós temos trabalhado com a ABRE, com o tema da política externa brasileira faz um tempo já, faz parte da nossa agenda, e devo dizer que essa parceria tem sido muito importante para nós, e temos explorado essas oportunidades que temos criado junto. E para nós, eu quero agradecer também a Ana, aqui presente, e a Marta, obviamente, foi muito importante porque é uma oportunidade para explorar os limites das relações internacionais e o diálogo com a realidade, né? Que é fundamental. Nós, obviamente, temos mais atuação na política, né? Ou seja, na política externa brasileira e tal, e sempre ficamos puxando a ciência, como nós chamamos, né? Mas o que nós temos visto é que há uma reação, uma resposta, e essa parceria, então, nesse sentido, é muito importante. E agradecer a Ana também, que veio de bem longe, e que acabei de conhecer aqui também. Um grande prazer, uma grande honra estar aqui contigo. E agradecer a vocês também, e desejo uma ótima e super produtiva jornada e uma ótima palestra para você, Ana. Aliás, se você quiser ouvir tudo que a gente está falando, pode pegar o fone também. Ou seja, a mensagem do fone não é só para eles, mas também para ela. So, Anna is with you now. So you don't need the headset anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is what it means to be international, so we are trying to grapple with different languages. So I wanted to thank, first of all, Marta for inviting me to be here, but also Gonzalo and Ana Claudia for making this possible. And thanks to all of you for being here. Okay, I guess I'm going to talk for around 30 to 40 minutes. So bear with me. So I'm just going to start like I did yesterday, but with the different kinds of questions. What have they done with our dreams in the calls of emergency and crisis? Where are our projects? And then I'm going to give you a quote from Krishnamurti. Time is the activity of the mind. Time is elusive. We cannot pin it down because it is that which is not. So I will ask a few questions and then I will proceed with the 2 key points that I want to make for my presentation today. So what are the stakes in our present when the present itself, as we know it, is ridden with violence? When the present as we knew it marks the time of disorientation, histories of fractured horizons. What are the stakes when these fractured horizons refuse to act as an urgent response to the state of emergency, as it is claimed by liberals and even more radical projects of today? What are the stakes when, as Gramsci says, the old is dying and the new is yet to be created? What is crucial then when we refuse to go along with these urgencies and crises and decide to grapple instead with the politics of uncertainty that takes this violence by the hand and generates sites of possibility that leave room for imaginaries and desires that do not take conquest and all kinds, including our ecologies themselves, and enslavement of existence as they are given? So these are the kind of 2 key, it's a series of questions, but 2 key points that guide this presentation. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 key issues. The one is, since we are all in world politics and international relations, is the relationship of language and time and how that relationship informs and shapes both supposed liberal capitalist projects, all in the name of urgency of climate change, and more radical projects will call for revolution, claiming that they are delivering us from fatal abstractions inflicted by the radical ideologies of the past of Western capitalism and the political system of liberal democracy, presenting themselves as universal, protecting us from all forms of terror and disaster. So here, in a sense, the first question that I want to posit for us is, many times we assume a lot of things. When we talk about crisis, when we talk about disaster, as if they are given, without ever really grappling with the question of language and time itself. So I want you to hear, what I want to do with that. And then as part of that, I want to look both at liberal projects. Basically, I will give you in a few seconds the ICP, the Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change, and what they argue the issue is around ecology. And then more radical projects that really claim for us to really think about ecology by adding what I call nature. And I will talk about that in a few seconds. And the second point that I want to make about the question of the relationship of language and time is that there are 2 key points that I want to address here, which is linear notions of time and then also retrojective notions of time. Linear, it's really well understood, past, present, future, and I will talk a little bit more about that. A cause and effect. We have a crisis, it was caused by this, the effect is this, and this is what we do to change it. Retrojective is a little bit more complicated because basically it asks us to look at the past in such a way that in the way that I will talk about it, as if it was made by capitalism itself. So in a sense, a retrojective here, temporality, is something that it really plays itself out in a lot of our projects, including the state, but we never think of that because it's given to us as if it was already there. And in a sense, this plays out itself very much in the ecological conversation. Time has special meaning in politics where the very distinction between truth and fiction has been made redundant so that the criterion is no longer accuracy, but rather conformity to the need of the moment. And here, this is where this question of crisis comes in. There is a crisis, the need of the moment, we have to do something without ever posing questions. What is this crisis? Whose crisis are we grappling with? And then also, who made that crisis and under what conditions? So in a sense, this rush to conform to the moment many times really takes away from democratic conversation. So for us, this is really, at least especially around climate change, we need to really ask who is positing this question of urgency. Okay, our present analytical and political challenge is to grapple with the ways time is entangled with the needs of the moment in areas of energy and climate change. Yet the politics of the ecological require understanding time. Notions like succession, simultaneity, duration, urgency, waiting, speed, geological revolution, money, and death are expressions of time and are entangled with the ecological and its models of security and development. Colonial epistemes and practices of time block the potentiality and affirmation of a planetary beyond capture and conquest. And I want us to think a little bit more about that around our own epistemes in international relations. What kind of notions of history do we presume or suppose in the way we think about sovereignty, in the way we think about development and security? So here the issue that, as I already said, these dominant logics and grammars of time, of modernity, capitalism, and ecology, time as linear, flowing in a particular direction, determined, sequencing, separable, immeasurable units, and time as retrojection, defined as a kind of projection that retrospectively testifies to what comes before, are really informing and shaping the contemporary way of thinking about crisis, ways of thinking about problems. So these modernist, nationalist, and capitalist iterations of times focus on linear teleologies and eschatologies. This orientation of the temporal operates through causality, stories of progress and growth, and ideas about movement from past to present to future and evolution. So this is one thing that, for example, we see very much in, as I already mentioned, in the Intergovernmental Report of Climate Change, where they are really telling us that, which is, its logic is based on a linear human progress. They're saying that the way that we can really get rid of the problem of climate change is by basically reducing, global warming by 1.5 degrees centigrade. And therefore, in that way, we can save ourselves from this ecological crisis. In a sense, this represents for us this newer installment of the scientization of climate change. So everything is being captured now by science, as if science itself, it doesn't have logics and grammars that informs and shapes the way that is organized and orders social life. So in a sense, immediately what becomes possible with that is to presume a certain empirics of social life, as if it's not up for discussion or basically a conversation around what kind of political do they presume when they are really demanding of us to assume that there is this crisis and we have to respond in that way. So in a sense, what I am arguing here is these catastrophic outcomes as they are presented to us, they evade basically uncertainty, the possibilities for a world as a project beyond global capital. In a sense, even this IPCC, which for the first time has mentioned the word colonial, it participates in the way that we can adapt, to climate change. And adaptation itself is a question of time. How do we adapt? Under what conditions do we adapt? It's never set up as a question. Okay, so I want to move a little bit faster, than this. Yes. So the second point that I want to make here is that in highlighting, of course, now everybody knows the question of the Anthropocene, which is also another way, or what a man argues, is a social contract. And it's a social contract that itself presumes a certain kind of temporality. And this temporality is a very linear temporality. If we do this, if we reduce carbon dioxide, we will be saved basically from this crisis. Here, what Mann says, and I will read it, the Anthropocene is an explicitly future-facing instrument of temporal power. Like all contracts, it restarts time on its terms. The distribution of responsibilities it represents is always also the closure of supersession of past arrangements. So basically forget all the violence that took place to make, to arrive at this ecological decimation. But we have to start from where we are at this point, because we are in a crisis. So a contract that has no expiration, like a constitution or the Anthropocene, is supposed to mark the end of the past and the beginning of a new time. So here you see this linear trajectory, but again, we are reanimating a particular social contract now in the Anthropocene language. So here what I want to highlight is this is a notion of adaptation, but what is coming also in more radical projects like Jason Moore, everybody has read some Jason Moore somewhere, is this notion of transition. And here again, in transition, there is a certain presumption of a certain kind of time and temporality. In Jason Moore, which is like, of course, Jason Moore, one of the interesting things that he's trying to do is to really, basically respond to the critiques by black feminists, by post-colonial theorists, and really, and some of the, kind of new materialism to add and a la Latour to add nature to Marxism. So here, Jason Moore rushes to say that we have to think nature along with capital. So ideas and language about, and how Jason Moore does that is by focusing a lot on questions of depletion, acceleration, exhaustion, have recently been taken up. And again, all these notions, all these concepts are really presupposing certain notions of time, which are really important for us, because when we talk about exhaustion, who is being exhausted? And what do we mean with exhaustion? When we say depletion, what do we mean with that? So ideas and language about depletion, acceleration, and exhaustion, a la Moore, have been recently taken by him, who attempts to provide a view from the future to mobilize peoples to collectively challenge the ways we understand the historical nature of exhaustion. It is not capital or nature that is exhausted, he says, but regionally specific relations of capitalization and appropriation. For him, exhaustion happens when particular natures, crystallized in specific reproduction complexes, can no longer deliver more and more work energy. And I want to highlight here, since we talked about yesterday feminism, Jason Moore uses a lot of Maria Mead's understanding of global racial patriarchal capitalism, never mentions much her work, as if he is reproducing this new language, these new insights. So this is a side point, okay? This is not my critique of him, but I just wanted to mention that. So basically he moves away from technology or imperialism as cause and effect, and he articulates the reorganization of global ecology in terms of the logic of accumulation regimes of capital. Global expansion gave rise to an enduring ecological inequality under a new extractive global division of labor, and creating a metabolic rift in the form of diminished human relations and disturbed processes and cycles of nature. Moore argues primitive accumulation, or the dispossession of property under colonialism, can be conceptualized as multi-scalar. Colonial land consolidation and the separation of producers from their means of production enabled the emergence of capitalism and multiple organizational registers, including individual farms and national balances of trade and debt. I'm reading what he's arguing in order to show that he still wants to basically reintroduce the notion of nature, within capital accumulation in such a way that then he can make an argument that we have to transition by suggesting, a revolution with a focus now on the relationship of capital and nature. There is nothing wrong with that. I agree with him on that register. What I want to argue here is how he's really playing with time and what his revolution does in terms of thinking about transition. And for him, when he talks about transition, is is us, he moves us away from causality, but without ever accounting what did it really entail to transition. What was left behind, in quotes here, in order to enable what he's talking about, the exploitation of nature through capital. So here, in a sense, Moore's philosophy of history is inscribed with the structure of time, which moves from attachments that exhaust and create antagonism to an attachment that dialectically mobilizes a planetary revolution. In Moore's monist terms, all energy systems and human economies are co-produced with nature. So here, what is interesting is about, in a sense, even himself, while he's talking about colonialism, while he's talking about enslavement, he uses the notion of nature and collapses all these things under nature. So there is a primitivism in his work that is really problematic. But again, it's all in the rush of a revolution in order to ensure that we don't find ourselves in this ecological crisis. Thus, in thinking and understanding the present and the emerging futures, only a conception of historical nature, he tells us, will suffice. But if nature is confined to the utopian of capitalism and capital's history, then nature can only be extended as a servile representation, a mimetic mode of what is experientially felt to be violence, and so is always already trapped inside a predefined meaning of what counts as materiality and history. If theft and exhaustion interrupt the movement towards nature, and paradoxically, which is the post-colonial critique, the indigenous critique, black critique, then paradoxically what makes speciology, or what he thinks nature is, we don't want to go back to the ancients here, but I think it's important, irrelevant for understanding materiality and history, then ethics and politics, insofar as they are grounded on this notion of nature, cannot simply be invoked, even negatively, as a model for thinking nature itself, and even less so for a dialectics and revolution. So if he presumes nature to be this subordinate thing that is going to be integrated in this revolution, in the dialectics, then in a sense he presumes the primitivism in such a way that it doesn't reopen the question, whose nature are we talking about? So his transition to rush for a revolution again reproduces exactly the colonial and enslaving project that he tries to claim he's against. So let me see time. Okay, so here, why is it important for us to think through this? I think what is important is to, especially for international relations, is to ask questions about the historiographies that we really draw upon to really think through state, sovereignty, development, ecological projects, because it's not enough to point to its historiography, but it's also to understand what such historiographies have done and continue to do in the way that they speak about the problem itself in the contemporary moment. So in a sense, it's not just because what's wrong with Jason Moore or what's wrong with IPCC, but rather what the effects of these conversations are in the way we imagine and understand the future. So here I wanted to move a little bit more to say that in a sense, Moore's presentation really participates extensively into capitalism's idea that is everything is basically an outgrowth of capitalism itself. And in a sense, in doing so, in a recursive sense, by going back and speaking about nature, he ends up reproducing exactly that which he wants to challenge. So without theorizing explicitly the structure of language, of time, of the revolutionary ecology, if you will, it is not possible to invent, in a Fanonian sense, a future that is radically unwritable, or what Fanon calls a tabula rasa, which opens in return a movement of temporalization that is never simply present or timely. So here, one thing that I want us to emphasize is that what does it really mean for us to invent something that is not written in the present. That means that, I mean, even capitalism itself experiments constantly with how to relocalize itself. So what will it mean for us to really rapture this kind of both linear temporalities, but also retrospective temporalities, in order to really imagine and invent something, that doesn't write itself a priori or a posteriori. Okay, so in order to do that, what I did, because I didn't want just to live with critique, which is what we all do in international relations, we all rush to critique everybody else, as if we don't, understand that there is a question of currency as well in the critique. And that's what I want to highlight here, that in a sense, this is how we go back to the past is also a form of currency. It's a form that gives life to our own epistemologies and theories. So in terms of knowledge production here is not only the stakes for our everyday life, but also the stakes for how we produce knowledge ourselves and what role we play in that kind of reproduction. So what I want to say here, in a sense, we are also part of the capital that demands of us to make ourselves brands, in order to reproduce ourselves. And again, in that sense, we have to really understand what the role of us is in doing so. So, okay, I'm going to move this. So what I wanted to say here, again, going back to what I just said, capitalism cyclically and recursively repeats the moment of the mounting of capture apparatus within the sphere of social relations as a crisis, but it also does the same thing for knowledge production. So these acts are impossible to historicize as they are irreparable moment of the moral condition whose effects we are still living through. That is, we ourselves have always already been captured, and therefore we have to understand what it means for us to be part of the history that is being given to us. And in a sense, it throws us back on the very limit of historicity. How do we historicize? And in a sense, I'm not critiquing Moore, just to say what's wrong with Moore, because it's very difficult to historicize. But at least we can ask questions. What are the implications of us historicizing in the way that we rush to historicize because we say we find ourselves in a crisis? So, and yet the social sciences, humanities, natural sciences insist historicizing through linear eschatological narratives and dialectics. David Marriott goes and argues that such a pressure on the rush to historicize in the form of dramatic narratology or dialectics really ask us to participate in history, which is a colonial, violent, racist machinery itself. So in a sense, international relations, we always say we historicize, now it's the new thing. But in a sense, if that is a racist machinery, how do we unpack that racist machinery without really, using other people as the expenditure for reproducing it? So to do so, I went to Octavia Butler, who is a Black, American writer, and who tries to grapple with the same questions as Jason Moore, as the IPCC. And with her, what she does, she tries to really, with fiction, to problematize the way we are understanding questions of nature, questions of colonization, but questions of the language of temporality, of time, and violence. So what Octavia Butler does, she goes back to Los Angeles, 2024, and then she's looking at, the books are called The Parables, if people are interested in reading them. And then she's looking at how global warming has changed the landscape dramatically. Fresh water is scarce and is as valuable as money. The middle class live in gated neighborhoods. All of us know what that really means because this is a global project. Using guns to keep the homeless outside their walls. Within these life conditions, Christopher Donner is elected president, promising the public to dismantle government programs and bring back jobs. Here, you see, she sets up the Christopher Donner as being this, she doesn't claim him to be a white one, but it is the old in a sense, and you will see what comes in a few seconds. And then the protagonist, Lauren Oya Olamina, a 15-year-old black girl who lives with her family in a walled neighborhood, and you understand what that means, walled neighborhood, not gated community, writes in her journal, "People have changed, the climate of the world. Now they're waiting for the old days to come back." Lauren does not place any hope in Donner. He is simply a symbol of the past to hold on to as we are pushing to the future. And she spends time equipping herself to survive that future. She practices with BB guns, collects maps and books on how Native Americans use plants, and develops a belief system, a Darwinian religion she calls Earthseed. Through the journals, readers are privy to Lauren's contemplations, sorting out nature from human-forced ecological events and patterns of inequality. When she talks about an early season storm blowing itself out in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, she says, and I'm reading this on purpose because in IR we tend to abstract constantly, but in a sense we are afraid to look at the details. So what is really important here is also how the text itself collects a lot of material, detailed material, to really disrupt this notion of fatal abstractions. And in a sense, this becomes really important in the ways that, she tries to claim how we, going back to the history, what is history that has not registered? What are details that have not been taken into account in the way we write history itself? So it's a bounce around the Gulf, killing people from Florida to Texas and down into Mexico. There are over 700 known dead so far, one hurricane. And how many people has it hurt? How many are going to starve later because of destroyed crops? That's nature. Is it God? Most of the dead are the street poor who have nowhere to go and who don't hear the warnings until it's too late for their feet to take them to safety. So what is really important here with Octavia Butler, she's really trying to also problematize who is hearing these issues around crisis, who finds themselves, too late in saving themselves. So I am just going to read a little bit here to go back to the 2 points. Climate change may shift ecological realities, she tells us, but it doesn't change failed patterns of entrenched violence, deliriums, and inequity. Not only has the pox itself already begun in the reader's time, but the social condition of the pox are deeply rooted in imperialism's colonization and fundamentalism's ideas of an anticipated something. So what Octavia Butler tries to do is to really disrupt this idea of what we are anticipating, the desires of anticipation to bring about social change. Because she says we have to see it in the interregnum. And what I mean in the interregnum, not the present, but the way these failed violences are continuing to impact people. So here, in a sense, for her is that it's really important that we don't rush, to come up with a solution, because in a sense, it's all these solutions that have really brought up these disasters and these violences. So I will, let me see time. Am I okay with time? Okay, 10 more minutes. Okay, this is good. Okay, I'm going to read a poem that she writes in the Parable of the Talents. And here, as the possible, how she really uses poetry as a possible side in a Fanonian sense to think of a leap. And a leap here is really challenging both this linear trajectory of anticipated futures, like in a causal sense, or this retrojective. We go back and we localize some of the crises as if capital does that all the time, as if it was there because of capital itself, as if it has founded life, as if it has founded, who we are. To survive, let the past teach you past customs, struggles. Leaders and thinkers, let this help you, let them inspire you, warn you, give you strength, but beware, God is change, past is past. What was cannot come again. This careful modulation orients us to realize that an open-ended planetary project cannot be foreseen or anticipated. We live with indeterminacy, without knowledge, and without fear, and therefore without future. So Butler really challenges the idea of future. You know, she's like saying, if we're going to think about, a transformation, we cannot think of a future that really uses other people's life in order to create itself. Yet Butler refuses to engage in the kinds of rapture-based apocalyptic narrative and dialectical productions that will make it difficult to understand the relationship between past, present, and future. Instead, her Black poetics focuses on the gradual ecological and social transformation. She asks us to recognize that the slow processes of violence that have rendered the parable future so dark have already begun in the reading moment, but she does not want to articulate these possibilities in a sequential or retrojective way. In short, Butler's sustained attention to the representational challenges of climate change informs the structure and the ethical investments of her poetics, in which coming to terms with climate decimation requires both a flexible attention to rethinking the past and the future, the colonial violence and the enslaving violence, and how global ecological capitalism reproduces itself as itself. Butler does not intervene in the temporal mediation of the structures of racial ecological capitalism. So here she resists the idea that we have to mediate the violence in order to come up with a future or transition into a future that is going to be better, but rather demands of us to stay with the failure of the social contracts and what the implications of those social contracts are today. So in a sense, she also challenges the idea of rushing to talk about ecological social contracts when other social contracts themselves are continuing and informing the failure of, the way we organize an ordered life. So here, Butler is orienting us to the failures of the confined institutions and projects of the racial ecological capitalist structures and pushes us to reckon the possibility of a catastrophic future as extending from the already catastrophic dreams and practices of the now dead. So in a sense, she demands of us to stay with the socially unregistered people, what she calls Blacks and indigenous people, because for her, all these people are already dead in the social contracts. So she's arguing we have to stay with that death, and in a sense, it's really important for us as IR scholars to think what institutional configurations and regimes do not register whom. And for her, this is the important question, and as well for my own project in doing what I did in the beginning. So she continues here that sorry about this. She orients the reader to a space where history, in quotes, can be attributed a different meaning, and future in which time, reference, and reality can acquire new values. Hers is an inventive Black poetics from the vantage point of the now dead that allow the possibility of generative relations where the connections between dead and living, humans, animals, and ecologies do not turn into innovative racial subsidies, but make such practices obsolete on the spot. This is creative energy, not inherited systems of abstraction. Her radically disjunctive move could be the leap for the condition of the possibility for generating thriving life conditions. And I want to emphasize this, the question of subsidies, both in terms of social contracts, but also in terms of knowledge production. Because Octavia demands that if we're going to go along with these temporal regimes, we end up really demanding of certain people to be the subsidies of, the way we are reinventing the future. So I will conclude by reading 2 paragraphs. In reading different structures and epistemes of time, ranging from linear to retrojective in scientific and literary texts that speak to the question of the ecology, we must not just identify preconditions for the advancement of eco-socialist activism on a global scale. We must also put pressure on the ways we inquire about ecological concerns. How a text chooses to draw on structures of time to organize and order thought has real consequences for the way it articulates and treats the notion of history. And here, when I say text, I don't mean just intellectual text. I also mean reports. I also mean bureaucratic certificates, documents that demand of us to organize and order our lives in the everyday. A focus on the relations of the structure of time and lives heretofore deemed impossible opens up the space long enough to allow us to point to interruptions of foundationalist temporal colonial systems, linear and retrojective. In so doing, this interruption orients us to a situation in which the planetary as a project has not yet been determined. So the projects of capital are not the projects of the wretched. So I want to emphasize that because in a sense, a lot of these readings that I did is to show that we end up ourselves colluding with the projects of capital as if that's the only way for us to really do life and organize our life. Something that is then radically unwritten and whose structure is aporetic. We don't know the structure yet. So in a sense, this is where the experimentation and invention comes in a Fanonian sense. Some texts focus on alternative formulations of history, which help us begin the difficult process of thinking differently about nature and capital. For example, Marxists, as I already said, have a great deal to say about the extended reach of our ideas about nature and the dangers that accompany what Moore calls the capitalocene. As the planetary justice implications come more sharply into focus, environmental projects have to contest racial ecological capitalism's more general description of its language of time. It is only then that we can point to the failures of global ecological capitalism and its various stories, anthropological narratives, grammars, and dialectical logics, and their derangements, often transitions of catastrophe, urgency, and crisis. The connections between the living and the dead, the intimate connections between the species and the planetary, are untimely and cannot be passed on. These are the words, the poetics, and the witnesses to untimely decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana. Muito obrigada, Ana. Eu achei que, enfim, gostei bastante da apresentação, porque dialogou muito, né, com o tema aqui do nosso encontro, né, e também com a própria disciplina, né, das relações internacionais, que é isso, né, o quão difícil é para a gente imaginar novos mundos, novos futuros, novas possibilidades. Como diz a música, o futuro está sempre repetindo o passado, né? E, nesse sentido, é isso que a gente estava discutindo ontem mesmo, né? Ou seja, se a gente vai lá para a perspectiva realista, a gente vê, né, aquele mundo cíclico, né? As repetições, as continuidades das guerras, né? Então, a gente explica as guerras desde a época do Peloponeso, ou a gente vai lá para o mote liberal, não é isso? Em que a gente fica pensando sempre em termos de modernização, teoria da modernização, e um futuro que reproduz, né, todas essas dinâmicas raciais, né, de classe, sexistas, etc. Então, o quão é difícil, né, esse movimento que o Ailton Krenak fala de adiar, né, o fim do mundo. Né, e, nesse sentido, você traz aí, né, o Fanon, né, que está justamente pensando um futuro, né, radical, né, no sentido de colocar abaixo, né, o que a gente tem aí dado, né, que é esse mundo bifurcado, né, entre duas zonas, a zona do ser, né, com todos os seus privilégios, e a zona do não ser, né, daqueles desumanizados, né, daqueles que, enfim, né, nunca tiveram a possibilidade de ter essas subjetividades reconhecidas, né? Então, eu acho que o que você traz é justamente, né, como que a gente vai inventar, né, esse novo mundo, né, que não reproduza, né, essas fronteiras estabelecidas, né, e essas inúmeras violências. E eu acho que o que o Fanon nos traz é justamente, né, essa possibilidade. Ou seja, a violência foi aquele que, num primeiro momento, né, a violência é a violência do colonizador, né? A violência não é a resposta, né, vamos dizer assim, do colonizado, né? Então, nesse sentido, o mundo que está aí, né, é um mundo que reproduz, né, uma série de violência. Então, eu tenho pensado muito isso na época da pandemia, né? Que todo mundo está falando, a questão das incertezas, a busca dos novos normais, como que essa busca do novo normal também é uma busca de um velho normal, né, com mais resiliência, né, que é essa palavra que vem sendo muito utilizada, né, e de repente se apropriando, né, de determinados conhecimentos indígenas ou outros, né, mas, enfim, e o que eu sempre digo é, tem uma galera aí, né, tem os povos indígenas, né, quilombolas, etc., que estão pensando nos novos normais, né, e que estão aí problematizando a dita normalidade há mais de 500 anos. Então, de alguma forma, aqueles que são, em geral, vistos como tradicionais, né, ou seja, não aptos à inventividade, né, como se as culturas deles fossem estáticas, essencialistas, são, de alguma forma, aqueles que também estão projetando novos normais e pautando essas invenções, né? Então, enfim, falei muito, mas só para falar que me fez pensar várias questões aí e vou abrir para debate. Quem tem interesse em fazer alguma pergunta aqui para a Ana, pode fazer em português, porque ela também está com fone e vai poder responder, ou em inglês, né? A Tati e João. Tati. E Dani.
Oi.
Thank you.
Oi, Ana. Oi, todo mundo. Boa noite. Primeiro, te agradecer aí pela sua fala que, enfim, bagunçou minha cabeça depois da Marta já ter bagunçado minha cabeça semana passada, porque a Marta é minha orientadora de doutorado e a gente estava conversando sobre algumas coisas que você tratou na sua fala. E aí eu queria pedir para você avançar em alguns pontos para, enfim, aumentar esse diálogo. Você estava falando da questão da crise climática, da temporalidade, e aí você traz a noção de contrato social. E aí, enfim, eu não estava pensando na questão do contrato social a partir da temporalidade e a questão da crise climática relacionada a isso, então já abriu outra frente aqui para bagunçar mais as coisas. Mas o que eu queria perguntar é, a partir de trazer o contrato social e trazer a temporalidade para pensar na crise climática, na crise ecológica, como que você entende o contrato social? No sentido de, no livro Contrato e Dominação, do Charles Mills com a Carol Pateman, eles debatem muito sobre o contrato sexual e o contrato racial, sobre ser normativo ou descritivo, e sobre ser possivelmente reformado ou se tem que ser abandonado. E aí eu queria saber, nessas suas relações que você faz aí com a crise climática e a questão de temporalidade, se você acha que o contrato social pode ser reformado ou se ele tem que ser abandonado e substituído por uma nova estrutura, por uma nova história, enfim. Talvez eu tenha dado algumas pistas em uma direção, mas eu queria, enfim, saber um pouquinho mais. Obrigada.
Boa noite, meu nome é João Urti. Obrigado à Abre por trazer a professora Ana Agathangelou. Eu tenho duas perguntas. Tem um trabalho agora do pessoal lá na Austrália, The Limits of Settler-Indigenous Reconciliation. Sarah Madison, Ravi de Costa e Tom Clark. E eles nos convidam que, em alguns momentos, o nosso lugar como colonos, o nosso papel, o que a gente pode fazer nessa reconciliação é fracassar diante do processo do projeto da modernidade, ou seja, não cumprir. Isso achei que dialogou muito de perto com essa tua proposta. Só que a minha pergunta é, como vender o projeto do fracasso? Como seduzir as pessoas para fracassarem coletivamente? A minha segunda pergunta é, existe, assim, nesse senso comum que permeia o pensamento em relações internacionais, como o pensamento em geral no Ocidente, esses mitos que são o folclore do nosso tempo, que são os filmes hollywoodianos, né? E aí, nesse ponto tem uma narrativa temporal que é bastante linear, que é assim, dos dinossauros passando pela evolução humana até os futuros distópicos. Que aí vem, né, Blade Runner, Mad Max e Matrix. Você acha que essas narrativas elas se tornam narrativas totalitárias de uma inevitabilidade, ou seja, nós estamos rumando inevitavelmente para esse futuro e isso acaba... qual é o papel que isso desempenha e como a gente pode combater essa certeza da inevitabilidade do desastre?
Olá, boa noite. Eu me chamo Dani Dias, sou doutorando do IRI da PUC-Rio. Quero agradecer a organização do evento e quero agradecer à professora Ana pela apresentação, pela fala muito inspiradora e muito potente. Eu entendo o Deus é mudança da Octavia Butler, inclusive como uma defesa do processo de transição, porque resgata o caráter contingente e precário do político. Então, eu gosto muito também dessa passagem da Octavia Butler. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, eu entendo que a transição, ela requer um nível... Todas as transições, elas requerem um nível de radicalidade. E elas partem também de algum nível de rejeição. E aí, eu particularmente, venho trabalhando com transição energética e tentando fazer um alargamento dessa concepção de trânsito e trabalhando também com a lógica de discursos de trânsito. E aí, ao mesmo tempo que eu quero fazer esse alargamento da percepção de trânsito, inclusive de coerência, de linearidade, quando a gente está falando de um trânsito, ao mesmo tempo eu me deparo com a necessidade de construção de coesão, por exemplo, quando eu falo que o Sul Global tem que participar do processo de tomada de decisão sobre a transição energética e sobre o que é a transição energética, considerando que a transição energética também tem impactos negativos para o Sul Global. E aí eu gostaria de ouvir um pouco sobre essa questão de tentar alargar o que é o trânsito, tentar trazer essa radicalidade, mas, ao mesmo tempo, inclusive, confrontar a abstração e tentar construir algum nível de coesão quando a gente está falando de questões mais pragmáticas da mudança climática e da transição energética. E é isso, muito obrigado mais uma vez.
Okay, about the social contract, I think, okay, I have to remove this, thank you. I was like, okay, Portuguese, English. Okay, the social contract, I think, one of the things like Mills, of course, talks about the racial contract, and, he tries to talk about how the social contract itself has, left the question of race out, and I really appreciate that a lot, but I also want us to ask more questions about what is this social contract, at what moment was it created, for whom, so just adding race to the social contract does not address the question that the social contract itself depends on enslavement and colonization. Conquest is at the forefront of the social contract. So if we're going to add race, does it really redress the question that the social contract depends on conquest? Does it redress the question that it depends on enslavement of people? And it's not something of the past. It's an ongoing kind of reproduction of enslavement and conquest. So for me, I think I'm going to raise it on that register. So when we are asking about dialogue of climate crisis with the social contract, for me, the social contract itself is in a crisis, and capitalism itself is trying to re-innovate in really actually appropriating a lot of radical critiques. And of course, capitalism has always done that. But what is interesting, and I didn't have time to go into that, one of the things that I raised in this project, which is a larger project, is to really understand that capitalism does not create life. Capitalism does not create existence, but capitalism always tells us that it does. And we all buy into the project. So for me, I think this is where we are confronted right now, that capitalism finds itself, where is it going to innovate? So in a sense, now for the first time it's being confronted that there is, I don't know, for a lack of a better word, even though I critique it, exhaustion, but it's not just exhaustion, it's actually decimation of life. When you are toxifying nature not meaning just the earth, but also ourselves as nature, how are you going to reproduce capitalism? So this is the question of the contract for me, that when we are thinking about temporality, we have to think about whose crisis are we talking about, and if the social contract itself sees its own limits, not the social contract in conjunction with capitalism, because I don't think capitalism can do its workings without the social contract. So in that sense, I think what we need to, you ask, can we reform it, or do we have to abandon it? This is a larger question in the sense that, as Octavia Butler does, we have to sit with the failure that we find ourselves in to understand what will it mean to abandon, which is also a temporal question, and what will it mean for us to reform, a temporal question as well. So that, I don't want to give it, an answer to that, because that means it's a collective question. What does it mean to abandon? So that would be at the forefront of the question that I will really pose for us. Then Juan's question, you make me laugh, okay? I will start with this, because you mentioned some of my colleagues, so, I have to be very careful how I respond to that. No, I don't have to. But anyway, I really like your question about, can we seduce failing collectively? I think this is really also a question of time too. Seduction is a question of time. How do we seduce? What kind of desires come into that question? So for me, I think, I don't even want to call it a seduction, because seduction also has its own kind of demands that, we have to give something in return for that. So I want to sit still with the failure instead of seducing anybody. Let's sit with that and see what it does for us, which I think goes back to your question of inevitability of disaster. Now we find ourselves in that road, because that's the project, basically. I mean, from the beginning, this project promised us the world. It promised us that Europe is going to be our savior. Okay, but Europe has never been our savior. And I don't mean Europe only as a geopolitics, but also as an imaginary, as a set of projects, that come with capital, But in a sense, it has become a totalitarian narrative that still promises us that it will save us. So maybe the question for us will be, maybe we don't need any gods, we don't need any saviors. We need to sit with, the ways that we find ourselves in that inevitability. So the common sense, yeah, for sure, but I don't think any longer common sense can reanimate international relations theory, because one of the things that we see now, many people are rushing, and I don't agree with them. I mean, a lot of the Australians are talking about leave IR and go elsewhere. I don't think we can do that either, because this is a kind of a postponement and displacement, and what I will call in my own work, derangement. You are deranging your positionality, all in the name of saving something, So this is also, again, going back to the question of temporality. So I don't want to derange anything. I am here, I'm sitting here. I mean, Gonzalo and I were talking before about questions of, in Brazil, 40% blacks, what does that really mean? In the United States, black people being killed daily, but also being toxified daily. So what does that really mean for us to derange our positions all in the name of saving? I don't want to, displace ourselves, because this is where we are. We are with IR. Let's grapple with that project. What are its limits? What limits it in the way it does? And then grapple with creativity and say, what will allow us to create a different side of knowledge production, but also a different world? Because it's not just a knowledge production. We want a different world to come out of that. So that's what I will say to your questions. Reconciliation, you get it from my question of transition and adaptation, how that really works itself out. And I'm not against people doing that kind of work, okay? I want to put that out there. But I think let's put ourselves in relationship to whom we are trying to reconcile, because that will give us something different, I think, because that will actually demand of us to ask, what kind of a world do we want? And what kind of a world do we want to be part of? And this is not just saving the indigenous people or the black people, but it's also the world I want to be part of, if that makes sense, So, Danica, thank you so much for your brilliant questions. I agree with you. I think Butler is struggling herself, but I also want to say that we have to figure out ways of reading text in ways that allows for fractures, in the ways that allows for certain level of what you call rejection, instead of trafficking in something else. Because Octavia doesn't resolve any kind of violence. She really says, let's sit with the violence. So for me, I think when she asked that question in the poem about God, she says, but the past is over, we cannot go back. So she's trying to challenge the idea of, using black thought or using indigenous thought in a kind of a utopic way. Because she says we cannot go back to that. We have to really, and Fanon does the same. when he does the critique of negritude, he's basically saying we cannot go to the past and Africa, and all those utopias. We have to grapple with where we are now. So for me, I want to answer to your questions about thinking through how we read. How we read text and how we, in a sense, allow for the tensions that exist with us and the text itself. And this is one of the key things that we don't do very well in international relations, because we are always rushing, and that's my critique of temporality, we are always rushing to say what's wrong with the text. Let's read for the tensions between us and what these people are saying. So if I was going to read the social contract with Hobbes, my question will be, Hobbes is writing around a time where Europe was not just Europe in, what do you call it, Western Europe. We're talking about the Mediterranean. Actually, Hobbes is trying very much against a particular Christianity, which is the Greek Orthodox, for people who don't know that. So when I'm reading Hobbes, I don't read Hobbes just for the social contract. I read Hobbes what he's trying to resist or challenge in relationship to what he wants to produce. So I read him for the tensions that are there. So I think this is also a question of temporality, and I like your decohesion, if I understand it, So I think for me, we do have to read for incoherencies in the text themselves. And what do they do for us when they don't fit very nicely with what we know and understand the world to be? So that does something different for us around the temporal question. It doesn't allow us to so easily say, oh, this person fits very nicely with my thinking, or this person really helps me go over here, but ask the question, what is this person makes me feel incoherent about? And in doing so, I think it opens a different conversation about creativity and poetics. Yeah, so.
Hello, my name is Fabio. I'm from PUC-Rio. I'm a postdoc, and I wanted to ask you, I don't know if it's a silly question, but you spoke, in your presentation, I had the impression that you were on one side talking that we shouldn't put people with nature because this is primitivism, so this is dehumanization in the Eurocentric discourse. And then you said we are all nature, and I agree with that. And I would like to know if you see a problem in this classic division between nature and animals and dehumanized people, and culture and the humanized European Western man, and if you are in favor of rethinking that, of dissolving that, if you see this dichotomy of modernity as a problem that affects our relationship to the other living beings. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. So if I am understanding clearly, you are asking me what do I think about the nature culture and what do I think of nature? Yes?
Yes, I'm asking what you think of this dichotomy, and if rethinking this dichotomy, of even dissolving this dichotomy of modernity, if you see it as a problem that took us here, and if you see the discussion about this, and perhaps even dissolving this dichotomy as a potential way. I know it's about time.
Yeah, it's about time. Okay, yes, obviously, I do see it as a problem. And I see it as a problem that was, of course, created with modernity and its own dualistic logics of nature and culture. And of course, I mean, modernity thought, I mean, it's much more complicated. I mean, because we can start with the 1600s onwards. But I think, you know, Marcia did a very interesting comment when she talked about modernization. So at different moments, I mean, modernity itself with enlightenment, you know, all in the name of forgetting Renaissance and the feudal period, it makes certain assumptions about nature. But of course, nature is not just the earth that modernity does, as you already know. I mean, as I already hinted at and suggest in my work, is that a lot of different peoples are nature. And they can be subordinated to what is culture, what is later civilization, what is modernization, you know? So all these grammars and logics inform and shape how we organize and alter our life today. So at the forefront of this project, I want to ask a question: what kinds of presuppositions are being made about nature, you know, and all in the name of culture, of course, okay? But of course there, as you can see, and we can have a longer conversation, I'm working on a book on this, what is the transition that is being made in order to make culture, okay? And what is being deranged in the process of making culture? And at the expense of what, you know? So here, I mean, in a sense, you know, we can use even ideas around development. You know, who is going to develop? What kind of structural adjustments have to be made in order to develop somebody? So these logics are not just of the past. These logics are ongoing logics. You know, so now capital itself, I mean, in its newer forms, has to do different adjustments. You know, but they are always structural adjustments because of this dichotomization of the world. So for me, I want us to ask this question as a primary question: what is nature? You know, what is life and what is death, for example, okay? Because the whole project of modernity is to save us from death. You know, is to create masters that are going to, you know, become infinite, you know? So if that's the project they want, let's ask them, what do they mean with that project? You know, so for me, I want to ask these questions as primary questions, not secondary questions, you know, and conjunct them with the secondary questions, because right now we have the nation state that talks about development, and that's where we are, but the primary questions are still there. They haven't been redressed. Who deserves to live? You know, who deserves to be part of modernization projects? Who deserves to be part of development projects? That's part of this primary question of nature and culture. Some people are always going to make it into culture. Some people will never make it. And not just people, I mean, also ecologies. Certain ecologies will never make it, okay? But even the ecologies that made it, they are being toxified because of what Juan already said around these totalitarian and fatalistic, you know, ways of reproducing capital. You know, so, yeah, so for me, I want to bring back to, because all of these projects that we are familiar with in IR, Hobbes, Locke, you know, Rousseau, Kant, all these people, what did they do? They took all the questions of the Greeks, but the Greeks had a much more complicated story to tell. But then suddenly says, okay, I'm reading Aristotle or I'm reading Plato in this very simplistic way. I mean, Agamben, for example, I always use Agamben as my example. He takes Vios and Zoe, but Vios and Zoe in the Greek reading is a much more complicated and open-ended question, not in the way that Agamben reads it through, you know, Catholic religion, in a sense. And that really has an implication in the way we think about nature as well. Yeah, so basically, for me, it's like, it's the question of time as well, because the modern time doesn't allow for certain natures, in quotes here, to register. And this has a lot of issues around, you know, energy and matter as well, you know, which is another part of the conversation.
Outra pergunta é ali. Aí você pode falar seu nome. Obrigada.
There is a question. Pedro.
Boa noite a todas, todos e todos. Obrigado, professora, por trazer a palestra.
Sorry. I have to do this. I'm sorry.
Boa noite a todas, todos e todos. Obrigado por trazer essa palestra que, inclusive, nos provoca, nos instiga e que realmente balança as estruturas, inclusive, do lugar onde estamos, das instituições. E eu queria justamente começar trazendo esse ponto em relação à historiografia que você aborda e gostaria de saber como é possível, de fato, retomar novas historiografias, novas perspectivas em torno dos conceitos, sem a gente cair no lugar do traidor, porque muitas vezes a academia, mesmo quando cheia de boas intenções, a gente, e mesmo quando tenta dar toda a validade para as comunidades nas quais a gente está estudando, está aprendendo com, partilhando, é muito sensível o lugar de não continuar repetindo a ideia de apropriação daquelas comunidades e se colocar num lugar de fazer a tradução daquelas vivências, sendo muitas delas, às vezes, vivências que não são escritas, são oralizadas. É incansável os documentários, as oportunidades que eu tive de conviver, tanto com comunidades quilombolas quanto com comunidades do candomblé, que é uma religião de matriz afro-brasileira, e verem eles sempre mencionando o mesmo problema. Os acadêmicos vêm aqui, aprendem com a gente e transformam em outra coisa que eles acham que é uma tradução, que é uma concepção válida para se passar para as revistas científicas. E muitas vezes, mesmo quando eivado de boas intenções, há uma grande dificuldade, de fato, de trazer essas comunidades para serem protagonistas realmente do processo decisório, de fato, Ainda mais assim, eu sei que a luta é uma luta deles e que, enfim, as comunidades elas já fazem a sua luta, como a professora mencionou, há mais de 500 anos, estão aí em resistência, em sobrevivência, mas a gente ainda continua batendo sempre na mesma tecla. E aí eu até puxo uma pergunta que eu queria fazer em adição ao que o João posiciona, que é como a gente conseguir, de fato, fazer com que as outras pessoas se sintam... Eu sei que você falou que o conceito de sedução não era o melhor conceito, mas se sintam com vontade de aderir a essas novas perspectivas, de constituir uma nova forma de ser, uma nova forma de entender esses conceitos e esse estar em sociedade, sem que seja sempre ter que traduzir tudo para um sistema moderno e principalmente capitalista, porque o capital ele ainda continua exercendo um forte fetiche. Não à toa, muitas pessoas que são contra a existência das comunidades quilombolas, comunidades indígenas, vão falar, não, os indígenas, os quilombolas querem ter um iPhone, eles querem ter um tênis da Nike, eles querem receber reais, eles querem, enfim, viver esse nosso estilo de vida. E, enfim, eles podem querer tudo isso, mas a questão não é exatamente esse o ponto, porque isso é utilizado como um discurso para deslegitimar, inclusive, reforçar tudo aquilo que eles não querem também. Então, assim, isso que é uma coisa muito delicada de se ver. E, por fim, eu gostaria de encerrar as minhas perguntas com uma provocação. É possível, diante de um sistema tão violento, pensar em uma transformação que não seja violenta também? Obrigado, professora. Agradeço.
Obrigada. Eu vou recolher mais uma questão.
Ele.
Oi. Tá. Meu Deus. Tá, muito alto isso. Obrigado pela oportunidade. Obrigado, Ana, pela fala. A minha pergunta é bastante parecida, mas eu quero relacioná-la especificamente com a sua crítica ao Moore e a questão da política da temporalidade na Revolução. Quer dizer, por um lado, eu quero fazer coro à pergunta final dele, né, se é possível uma transformação não violenta numa sociedade violenta. É muito importante, mas nessa esteira, essa ideia, esse problema que você identifica no Moore, com o qual eu concordo, com a sua crítica, no caso, da revolução como algo que tem essa temporalidade do futuro, tem uma violência muito grande, que é parte dessa leitura de revolução como algo futuro, que é o apagamento de várias revoluções que acontecem cotidianamente no presente. Né? Há 2 semanas atrás, eu conversava com os colegas na PUC falando sobre, né, a crise climática, e, meu Deus, o que podemos fazer? Numa sala com 20 pessoas, sabendo que a gente precisa de 10 pessoas para fechar uma mina de carvão. Né? Com um pouco mais que isso, a gente fecha um aeroporto, se a gente quiser. E não estou falando aqui, né, o call to arms, sabe? Não estou aqui convocando. O que eu estou fazendo existem pessoas que estão convocando, fazendo esse tipo de convocação, e acho que parte importante do nosso papel enquanto acadêmicos é reconhecer que essas convocações estão sendo feitas, essas disputas sobre a temporalidade da revolução, trazendo a revolução para o presente, existem, e acho extremamente importante que nós as legitimemos, que nós demos legitimidade a essas lutas. Existem pessoas que estão colocando seus corpos no caminho de tratores, fechando minas de carvão. Existem pessoas que estão interrompendo o fluxo de aeroportos para diminuir que estão fazendo greve contra a crise climática, que estão ocupando florestas para evitar, né? O João falava mais cedo dos Guarani, é parte disso, né? Então, a minha pergunta é sobre, né, de novo, no sentido da dele, parte dessa política de temporalidade sobre trazer revolução para o presente, isso como se encaixa no seu pensamento? Né?
So both of the questions are, kind of similar, So is it possible to do transformation without violence? Okay, to answer this, very simply, go to Fanon. Fanon says, no, you cannot do revolution without violence, okay? So that's where I stand with that, okay? But Fanon was really, didn't shy away from the complexities of the temporal question of the revolution itself. Okay, because for him, he was like, he didn't rush to go to the one group of Africanists or to the negritude movement. I mean, he learned a lot from Césaire, but he wanted to sit still with what will it mean for us to invent, make leaps without reproducing the same bourgeois projects that he was really critiquing. So the same response I will give to this kind of question, okay? So for me, it's not, what's wrong with this movement, because for me, the movements are really important for us. Fanon will not shy away from a movement, okay? So if we're serious in international relations about transformation, we have to take seriously the movements themselves. The tensions that exist in the movements, like I said previously, but we also have to look at some of these movements and what they are themselves colonizing or enslaving in the process of all in the name of revolution. Okay, so because revolutionary work can happen without enslaving and colonizing people. So at the forefront of the transformation that I want to talk about is we cannot really get rid of conquest and enslavement without violence, but we have to have some clarity not to really say, oh, once, Fanon does a wonderful job. As you all know, I write on Fanon. Fanon really grapples a lot with the decolonial project. And he says, just because now the colonizers, we kick them out, then he goes through like 2-3 chapters engaging with the bourgeoisie, the nationalist bourgeoisie. So in that sense, for us, we have to think about, all in the name of revolution, the nationalist bourgeoisie basically reanimates, or to use the word of cohesion, makes itself cohesive, or collates itself in a particular way. So I think we need to really grapple with this question. And again, I mean, the movements themselves are full of contradictions, okay? And they're full of contradictions, not just because people, are crazy, but because people are grappling with power. And IR is about power, okay? So we have to ask this question. What do we do with the power that we have? What do we do with the power that we don't have? So for me, I think if I'm going to answer your question, I think maybe we have to go back to the violence cannot be thought outside power. And that's where the time question becomes really significant. Ultimately, what I talked about today is about the relationship of time, power, and violence. So you are asking me to answer the question, all the while I'm stepping back and I'm saying, let's sit still long enough to understand what kind of power is being generated through what kind of forms of violence, what kind of power is being generated through what kind of movements, and whether those movements themselves reopen up the question to certain issues, which is about what world do we want to create. So at the forefront of this is, what world do we want to create? And this is a response to your question, because for me it's not about us speaking about what indigenous people say. It's not speaking about what black people say, which that's what Moore is trying to do, but it's what kind of world do we want to create and what kind of world do we want to be part of. It's not about the indigenous people in a fetishistic way. Indigenous people are part of the community that we are part of. So equally, we are asking this question. It's not about, let's try to integrate all these people. It's just, okay, do I want to be part of a community that toxifies everyday water, all in the name of Nike shoes? Okay? I mean, if we ask these questions, then we have some answers that we have to really think more seriously, rather than just rushing to say, okay, that's what I was trying to critique. Rushing to really respond to the crisis does not address the question of what is the community or communities that we want to be part of. I don't want to be part of any community that uses me, to conquer other people or enslave other people, And if I don't want to be part of that, then what do I do to prevent that from happening? And that implicates us in a very different way than we are being asked to be seduced to be implicated. So, yeah.
A gente vai finalizar agora. Queria agradecer muito a Ana e todo mundo também que ficou até agora aqui, né? Eu tenho um último recado aqui, que a gente vai ter uma confraternização na quinta-feira, no Armazém do Campo, com roda de samba, e os ingressos estão à venda no Simpla, para quem quiser, tá certo? É isso. Boa noite aí, pessoal.